Let's look at the breaking out of World War I. It was caused by an incident.
Franz Ferdinand.
The assassination. Sorry?
Franz Ferdinand, the assassination of
Correct.
Franz Ferdinand.
Yeah, not the band, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was actually on a parade. Now, there was a group who were put together called the Black Hand, and they were going to make sure that they assassinated him for political reasons in Sarajevo. Now, what happened was a guy threw a grenade. It missed Ferdinand. It hit the car behind and blew them up. So a load of people went to hospital, and of course, the Archduke escaped. Now, the guy who was in charge of everything had enough. He thought, oh my goodness, this is the end. So what he did was he panicked, took a cyanide pill, and threw himself in a nearby river. Now, the cyanide pill didn't kill him. It just made him sick. So he puked up all the rest of the cyanide tablet. The river wasn't deep enough to drown in. It was only about 6 foot, so it probably went up to about his neck. And so he got out pretty easily, but then got caught. Now, the rest of the guys were going, oh my goodness, this is just terrible. I can't believe that this was the case. And they went for a coffee, sat in a restaurant and just saying, you know, let's just have some food and we'll review what we need to do next. At that moment, Franz Ferdinand decided to go to the hospital on a detour from a normal route to check on how people were. And it took him past a restaurant where the rest of the gang were waiting, who pulled out the guns and shot him in the neck. And that killed him. And that was the incident that started the First World War. Now, here's the thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation where you're driving the car and your missus has told you you've gone the wrong way? And you don't want to start an argument, just go, even though you know you're going the right direction.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, very interesting. The same thing happened in Colombia in times of Pablo Escobar. They were also, I mean, there were several chances that they could have stopped the whole thing, and because of coincidences like this, it just didn't happen. So I think it's just very interesting. So once again, how can we compare this to what is happening right now?
Well, you got to look at the fact that you can't write life like this. You just got to look backwards and see how all the threads come together. Because this particular incident was enough to spark the war to end all wars. Now, remember, that was the war that went on from 1914 through to 1919. Yeah. In the middle of which was the Spanish flu. 100 years ago is the coronavirus part 1 that killed hundreds of millions of people around the world. Mm-hmm. So it all ties in with right now as well. Yeah. But then to end it all, so go on.
No, and what happened in that specific time in the Spanish flu, it was actually not Spanish. It was just here in Kentucky or in Oklahoma or whatever. And then the soldiers that were sent there were the ones that triggered the whole thing in Spain. So it's just very interesting to see how history is read from you can see it backwards. That's the only way to see it. So interesting, very interesting.
And as you rightly say, it wasn't the Spanish flu at all, mm-hmm. but it has been called that forever. And I'm sure Spain does not like the fact that people talk about 100 million people dying because of Spain when Spain had nothing to do with it.
Yeah. Well, same thing here. I mean, they're saying the Chinese plague and the Chinese plague. And yeah, it might have started there, but the ones that, I mean, right now, for example, how is the United States going to be judged? Because of course, it's a country that has the most deaths and I mean, it's just interesting to see how things are going to be playing.
Absolutely. But when we look back at it in 100 years, Ernesto, they won't be saying that the toilet paper diaries had anything to do with this. So at least we can rest quite happy that we are ignored for the madness that's happening right now. So let's take the next thing that happened, which was the war to end all wars from 1914 to 1919. The Spanish flu, not from Spain, happened during that time. But when it came to an end, finally, they had the Treaty of Versailles, where everybody was brought around to settle all the world's differences and decide what's the best way to carve up the world and make it better for all the victors. So it was all about spin. It was all about keeping the victors happy. And as they did it, this was a war to end all wars with a treaty to end all treaties. What we didn't realize was what a mess that was going to be. Within another decade or so, you had the Second World War, which was even bigger and even worse. They made such a botch of the Middle East, not thinking about cultural considerations, religion, the background and the borders of everywhere, which is a battle and an ongoing issue that even now in these times, 100 years later, we're still suffering from. Plus also Woodrow Wilson, who effectively was in Donald Trump's seat, or he's in Woodrow Wilson's seat, you choose, denied Vietnam self-determination from France. And so that years later, decades later, turned into the Vietnam War, which ultimately America got into again, and that didn't pan out particularly well for them. So the treaty that was there to put an end to all wars was exactly the piece of paper that started a ton more.
Yeah.
Does this sound familiar?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, this is one of those things that you say, well, I'm going to take a decision which is going to benefit me right now, but it's going to possibly create a huge chaos. Have we been living in those circumstances recently?
We always have. But most of the time people don't know, because it's like a fish swimming around the world looking for water. Where's this water thing I've been told about? Just like Nemo. And the fact is you're in it. We're too close to it to be able to see how it happens.
Yeah, I was reading a very, very interesting metaphor, a very interesting example of what they were saying. Well, if you take black ants and red ants, put them inside a vase or a jar, and and if you just put them inside the jar and don't do anything, they're going to be friendly to each other. Everything is going to be fine. But if you take the same red ant and black ant, put them in a jar or put them in a whatever it is and shake the jar and then put them there, guess what's going to happen? They're going to start killing each other. And this is exactly what's going on. I mean, it's not about people living together and how they're doing it. It's about the person that actually shake the jar. And this is exactly what it is. I mean, every time that you see something, so that you will be able to put it into context, you need to think, well, who is shaking the jar before you can actually figure out what is going on? Because this is exactly what happens in the Treaty of Versailles. This is very similar to what you were saying.
And are they crying wolf? And is it fake news? And is it disinformation or misinformation? These all have to be told. And also, when you talk about ants, did you know that there's a place, I think, ant that just kills every other ant? Nothing else, just kills every other ant. And they started growing and breeding. And so they're basically wiping out all the other ants. But there's one place, I think it's in America, we have to check on it, where there's a corner of the street where they're fighting non-stop, these two sets of ants coming together. That sounds familiar. And it might be the only proper war that's happening in the world right now. Thank goodness.
Well, that reminds me also, I think you also have it somewhere there as an example, so possibly you can talk about it. What happened with the Black Plague and the rats?
I was going to say that this is a classic story of long before our time, long before anyone's time. Take yourself back to Europe. And what you had during the 14th century was everybody was so, I mean, this is again fake news. The religious people were saying cats are in league with the devil. What? Yeah, cats are in league with the devil. Kill all the cats. So they did. They went around slaughtering cats left, right, and center, believing that cats are in league with the devil. Now, as a dog person, I still think they were right. Cats are in league with, no, I'm joking, that's not right. So what they did was kill all the cats so they could get their hands on because they wanted to prove this point. But what they didn't realize was that the rats were going to cause the Black Death. So the Black Death then started wiping out everybody as rats went crazy, biting everybody. And it's actually the fleas on the rats that went out and spread the plague. Now, the thing is, it would have happened anyway. But if it had cats, your average cat can kill 50 rats. So all those cats they killed would have been the best line of defense. So in the same way as if you're a fireman and you're fighting forest fires, you can stop the fires spreading by cutting down a load of trees to make sure that it doesn't jump. By having the cats there, they could have stopped a lot of that Black Death with the rodents who were breeding and finding more. They were eating from the dead bodies and so on. Maybe cats could have stopped it, but they clearly didn't. So there we go. It's not the first time this has happened. But sometimes it happens in a good way. So let me give you an example, and we can all give thanks to exactly how this happened. Let's take ourselves back to something that was not one of America's proudest moments, but it is a true story. And this is a real-life story of Squanto. Now, Squanto, or Tisquantum, as he was known, was captured as a Native American by explorers around the year of 1590 and taken to Europe as a slave. Now, he escaped and spent the next 20 years or so earning money and doing the best he could to get back to the New World to see his family. When he finally gets home, he finds that his village is wiped out. But not only that, almost every Native American Indian on the East Coast has either died of diseases or been slaughtered or fled out of the way. His village is gone completely. So he's solitary for about a year, just surviving off the land, completely upset, and then stumbles in by accident a group of starving Englishmen who are trying to make a colony in a place that they called Plymouth. Now, this is key, and this is where it all comes full circle. Let's put this in perspective. You've got this guy Squanto, who's got diddly squat. He's on his own. He bumps into a load of English people who are starving. He knows English people because he speaks English. He's a Native American, so he knows how to plant crops and help people to survive on the land. And that became Thanksgiving. It's a true story.
What are the odds of that?
Nobody else in the country, apart from this group of Brits and this one guy, at the best of it, has found himself a horse and a dog. So you just can't write those stories.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing as right now. I mean, you cannot write this. It's just impossible to think that this was going to be happening. However, it is just, in a way, we have to consider ourselves lucky, even though possibly at this point it's not really something like that, because there's generations that haven't really lived into so much craziness. We are seeing it live developing. This is a real life soap opera, which we have no clue how it's going to end.
But it's not the first time. Let's look at something else. I'll just mention a couple of things. What's the most famous movie of all time that everybody watches again and again and again? We love Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, and it's about a 12-hour love story involving a boat and an iceberg.
Titanic.
Titanic, the unsinkable ship. But it doesn't matter what you do, it's the safest ship ever built. Oops, what happened to that? Let's throw in another story. The Three Musketeers and all the stuff that happened with King Louis XIV. King Louis XIV did a lot of things that made him very unpopular, but one thing that ended up coming back to bite him in the neck was his design for a guillotine that could be painless and quick and less messy than having a guy with a big axe is waiting just to chop everybody. And guess who it got used on? The king. He couldn't have measured it better himself. But then you got modern versions of this, Ernesto. And right now, the one saving grace, apart from the internet maybe, and also Zoom, is Netflix and the other streaming companies. Now, let's take us back to 1985. In 1985, BlockBuster opened their very first store. Now, BlockBuster, only you and I are old enough to remember what BlockBuster was. Nobody else will know. They were basically, well, do you want to explain who BlockBusters was?
Yeah, well, it was the predecessor from Netflix. I mean, they were shops, and you used to have a ID card, and you just go there and spend 3-4 hours inside the shop trying to decide which movie were you going to watch, and then you will pay and you will take it back. And the reason why they didn't work was because of the late fees. So basically what Netflix came up with was, why don't we do it by mail, and we don't charge any late fees? And then they went to try to sell it to his name was Huizenga, Dave Huizenga, because it was one of the big success stories in the 1980s. And he said, no, you know what? I mean, we have shops all over the world. We are own the market. There's no reason why for us to try something else. And guess what happens? Within a few years, they went out of business.
Completely. He tried to sell Netflix to BlockBuster for $50 million. They, at the time, were worth billions. And at the time, they had 60,000 employees, 9,000 stores, and around the world, everyone saw them as the name for movies. And therefore, you look at it now, and Netflix owns the roost. And if only they'd thought about it different. But this is not an isolated incident. Think about the original mobile phones. Here we are with an iPhone. Nice touch screen. But you remember when everybody had a Blackberry, and Blackberry meant business phone? Yeah. And it was designed, I believe, by Apple, or was it? I think it was Apple who designed the touch screen and said to Blackberry, would you like this design? And they said, no, people like to touch phones. They like the spinning ball. It feels very, very tenacious for them to have it. So no, we don't want some blank screen. And history is still biting them.
Yeah.
Because now it's an iPhone or a Samsung and not a button anywhere. Thanks for watching the show. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you watch all the videos over here. There's two choices for you. Or, of course, I'm Dave Crane coming from Dubai.
And this is Ernesto Verdugo coming from Houston.
And I think we should send a message. Hold on.
What is this?
Subscribe.